We're not trying to make the roster win today. We're trying to build the roster and the systems and put the systems in place so that we get the best team that's way greater than the sum of its parts for the long term. You know, we're interested in creating the Astralis of Valorant as opposed to a team that can just win a championship.
One of the most interesting paradoxes in the Valorant world is that one of the most sort of high-flying names in NA esports and in NA Valorant, one of the most well-known brands, is also at times the most enigmatic, especially in terms of, you know, what goes on under the hood. And let me tell you, you're going to be looking forward to seeing what's under this hood, baby. Of course, finally have a chance to talk with DDK, who has recently been announced as the GM, of course, for Valorant operations at 100 Thieves. DDK, man, thanks for being with us. Great to finally get you on the show.
Yeah. It's been a while because before I was being asked when I was casting to come on frequently because, of course, you know, we know each other and we've done loads of shows together. So it made lots of sense, but I could never make it work because I was doing the casting and I was full-time with AimLab as well. So kind of just couldn't quite make it work. But I switched jobs so I can be on the show.
Oh, is that way? Yeah, thank you. You're far too kind. Now,
he became a GM. He became a GM of 100 Thieves in Valorant just so that he could come on Valoranting. That's how much he fucking loves us, Uber.
It's true.
I mean, listen, I don't think I'm embellishing when I say this is a great opportunity to talk to you, especially with not only just the transition you've made from a caster. I'm sure we're all interested to hear how that sort of went, but also, of course, the way the team's been performing and how you sort of started to build that up. So a lot of questions here, obviously. Vans and Mitch will be chiming in. What I want to do to start with is we have a timeline, right? A 100 Thieves timeline, which, you know, you sort of come in at the end a little bit. Here's this unwieldy thing, right? So forget all this stuff, because right here, this is where you were getting fucked by Riot trying to cast their game. Remember that part there? Because I do. Yeah. And then over here, obviously March 22. You and Sean were announced. So, first question for you is, man, like, how did this sort of come about? So, how does a top caster in multiple games sort of, you know, start to begin conversations with a team and saying, hey, you know, we know you're a caster, we know you're on air, but we want you to be our GM. Like, how do they sort of make that leap, or how do you make that leap? And, you know, how'd this all come about?
Yeah, I think late last year, it kind of started with a conversation I had with the VP of Esports at 100 Thieves. And, you know, I was living in Culver City and we knew each other and we were at a dinner one time. And he mentioned in casual conversation, oh, by the way, like we were considering you for this position. However, you know, it wouldn't work out because we need someone that's based in LA. And yeah, you're moving away from LA. So never mind. And I was like, oh, okay. And one of the reasons why, after inquiring into why that would be even the case, because I was surprised to be considered, is just because of just having such a long history in the game, understanding the game pretty well, understanding the scene quite well. And, you know, they've been looking for someone, as you just showed with that timeline. A lot has happened in the roster and they were operating without a GM. So they've been considering for a long time internally, you know, when should we get one? Who should it be? What kind of characteristics should they have? So I think they cast their net quite wide in terms of what that could look like. And then we're kind of trying to narrow it down. So that was kind of initially what happened. And so obviously, you know, that ended with, yeah, we're not actually interested, but we kind of were. So I was then, you know, starting to think, kind of planted the seed. Okay, actually, would this be something that could make sense to me? You know, I didn't really anticipate myself not casting. But the more I thought about it, I was like, this actually makes a lot of sense to me because for those who are familiar with my content over the years and some of my history, I've always been very obsessed with player performance. I've been a player and I've returned to competition many times over the last 2 decades. And I've seen all the ins and outs of esports. I've made so much content that's very, very analytical, both on the performance end as well as like micro end and the macro end. And so in that sense, I was like starting to kind of think about it. And it's like, oh, okay, well, what is the GM role really? You know, it's many things. You know, it's essentially all of the things. You know, your role is essentially to make sure the team wins and you get given the authority, the resources to do that. And you can do that whichever way you want. You can hire any players you want. You can fire anybody you want. You can create any structures or systems you want. You know, the flexibility is really ultimately up to you. So with that in mind, I was thinking, well, this is interesting because I feel like, you know, there's a lot of areas in which I have seen there be, let's say previous 100 Thieves rosters. Clearly, you know, you have, you know, not the people in the right places seeing what's going on and being able to, you know, understand the signals or the signs or how to intervene in a way that could have maybe saved the roster. Because I think that, you know, the past 100 Thieves roster, let's say with, you know, the one with Steel, Nitro, and Ethan and Hiko, and Asuna, that was probably always going to be, there was always going to be some big cuts there, I think. But I think you didn't have to, I think you could, lopped off the arm as opposed to kind of just destroying everything, which is kind of eventually what had to happen. And I think, seeing this story play out over the years as a caster, especially, seeing these team dynamics that kind of eventually, you'll hire, all these players that have like big names and a lot of value, and then invariably they get mismanaged and it just kind of dies. And the expectation is that you put a team together that's going to perform now, but there's not a lot of development or management that allows that team to thrive and grow together to let's say, have an era like an Astralis team did in CSGO. There's not many teams that exist like that. So the more I thought about this and the more I thought about these questions, how do you solve these problems, the more I was interested in the roles. So it's a very long answer, but you're probably going to get a lot of long answers from me.
That's totally fine. I know like Vans and Mitch as well will be chiming in as we sort of go. Now, so we talk about sort of how this came about for you. How did Sean factor into this? Because it definitely, obviously, with the timing of the announcement and obviously what preceded it and sort of precipitated maybe a move away from casting for the two of you, it definitely seemed like a package deal. Like to what degree was sort of Sean involved in these talks? Was it more coincidental? How'd that all come about?
Yeah, I think, firstly, just to kind of pick up a little bit and where I was, obviously, I ended it by saying, oh, and they told me that I wasn't actually a candidate. Yeah. And then, later on, I reached out to continue conversations with them because, they were having more struggles with the roster. And I started to have to consider other options as a caster because I was feeling as though things wouldn't pan out for me in the sort of right ecosystem as a caster at this time. So I was looking at other options and the conversation opened up again. So I've been having that conversation for a while to kind of see if it was a match. And I know internally there was some I think they weren't all on board internally. I think because they take this very seriously. They want to make moves like this and make it stick as opposed to just throwing anything in there. And I think they realized after some of the performances in the previous stage of challenges that, okay, something really had to happen.
Sure.
And at the same time, Sean was also feeling similarly. He's like, okay, well, I need to assess my options here as well. I feel like I'm not going to be able to reach my goals with casting, the goals I have with casting, with the way that things are panning out. And we've been kind of, running into some of this resistance for some time now. So he was starting to reach out as well to see what his options look like. And so it kind of so happened that, the timing kind of came about where it's like, hang on. So, this is something that Sean's interested in. It's something that I'm interested in. And at the time, obviously, we understand that Mike was still a free agent as well. So it just kind of like, okay, this seems to be like it makes a lot of sense. Everything's lining up in terms of the timing. So it ended up being something that we kind of, went into together on ultimately, all at the same time. Again, it was like separate reasons. Like we never really discussed it a lot or anything in that sense. We're kind of trying to make moves that makes a lot of sense for us personally, our own goals, but that just all sort of aligns just in a happenstance way. So yeah, it's just a freak kind of timing thing,
sure.
Honestly.
I think that like maybe the coincidental nature of it for many people sort of definitely made it more exciting. Mitch, you want to chime in here? We can probably put you guys on the screen behind because while I'm talking to Dan,
I like see hidden. Yeah? It's fucking 5 a.m. for me, dude.
You guys can do us a favor. Raise your hand while Dan's full screen if you want to say something because then I can see it. But yeah, go for it, Mitch.
Perfect.
Pick me, teacher. So Dan. Listen, you used to be a professional player. Sean used to be a professional player. Come into a roster, get the ability to build a roster. At any point, was there like that little inkling? Was Sean kind of like, you know what though? I could kind of entry though, couldn't I?
I think that the thought definitely crossed Sean's mind that so I could do this. I could be an in-game leader. There's not a lot of in-game leaders. Yeah. That's always an issue in North America. So I think that thought always crosses his mind. For me personally, I will go back to competing if I ever can. But it's sadly for me, all my expertise is in the kind of arcade FPS genre. So I think the last time I was competing was recently. So that kind of scratched that itch for me. But it is weird because I do feel like all the time that I feel like I missed the boat. I was born too early to kind of to experience what the players get to experience now, and it's kind of crazy. But yeah, if Diabolical's revived or Quake or whatever, I'll try to find a way to compete.
I mean,
again.
I'm
But,
just
you know,
saying
this is
there was a title that was sort of teased a little bit recently. It's Overwatch 2. Have you heard of it? It's like Pixar characters trying to fucking kill each other. Does that tickle that itch?
It's 5v5 now.
I mean, look, I digress. I kind of want to know when you guys sit down and you go, all right, I am now the GM of 100 Thieves. You know, Sean's now coach here, of this team. What is staring back at you when you look at that roster on the table? What is, let's say, I'll use air quotes, what is the problem that you come in and say, we have to fix this? How did you characterize it?
So you mean with the roster that we were kind of coming in with?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I think we all came in with, I mean, the thing for Sean and I think, like you mentioned, at heart, philosophically, we're competitors. So it's all about being the best. That's the only thing that we're interested in, and using sort of the experience that we have and vision that we have. It just, again, that's something that also lined up. I think this is one of the reasons why it made so much sense, is that we both agree that we're trying to build the most optimal roster possible. We're not trying to make the roster win today. We're trying to build the roster and the systems and put the systems in place so that we get the best team that's way greater than the sum of its parts for the long term, because that's the long term is, where you're going to win the championships like back to back, and you're going to create a legacy. We're interested in creating the Astralis of Valorant, as opposed to a team that can just win a championship. Because it's, I'm not going to say anyone can win a championship, but lots of teams can come and win a championship. It's the right meta for you. It's, there's so many different things that can go into that, but very few teams actually survive past that process. So that's immediately, what we're trying to think about when we're thinking foundationally, how should we set this up? And one of the things, we're coming into a roster is we need to make sure that, firstly, that we have the players that are all kind of on the same page in terms of where they're at in their careers, because that's kind of that's a really big issue that can happen. Is you have players that are at different parts of their careers, it can require a lot of investment of time in terms of managing that relationship. It's not that you can't make it work. It's just that now there's a massive burden of management in terms of how you manage
you
those
reconcile
players
those
to make sure that they're performing well.
So you sort of feel like you have to reconcile different aims and sort of overarching objectives when players are at different parts, different seasons in their career.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's the case that, for example, if you have a player like an Ethan or a Hiko, players that they've been through a lot of different rosters. They've done the grind. They've been with young players before. They've experienced a lot of different kind of looks to their careers, and they're extremely accomplished and great players. There are the kinds of things that motivate them, and the kinds of things that that they're going to be looking for in terms of how the team operates will be just a little bit different than if you have younger players who are in a position to be essentially way more coachable, because they have less experience. So that actually gives you the opportunity as experienced individuals, in terms of people, like Sean and myself, to be able to guide the development in a way that kind of makes sense. So you get a cleaner slate in that from that perspective. So that's also quite beneficial. There's kind of less baggage there. There's less expectation to win immediately. There's less issues because, for example, when you're managing 5 players on a team, there can be lots of different interpersonal issues that can kind of crop up. And these things can be direct, or I should say explicit, or it could be something that is a little bit more indirect. You can have players that might not even describe or talk about some of the issues that it may be having. Maybe they shut down a little bit more. Maybe they're a little bit more blamey. Maybe there's a bit more resentment there. It really depends on the type of person. But generally speaking, it's a lot easier, I think, in the position that we're in, to say, okay, well, we can see that there's a lot of talent that's available to us, and we're looking to kind of build a roster that's going to survive the long term. We're looking for different qualities than maybe the average person might be looking at as a fan, who's going to look at, let's say, somebody like Wardell and be like, Wardell, yeah. In fact, when we had lots of interviews with players and we're doing this process of, figuring out how we can best make this roster, and everyone that we spoke to, all the pro players, are like, Wardell's got the best operator in NA, if not the world. This guy is incredible. There's so much respect for a player like Wardell in terms of his skill, but there's so much more that goes into the selection of the roster and the pieces than just the skill.
Sure.
So we had to assess that, and the culture fit. Will the players fit the kind of culture that we want to create? How amenable will they be to that? How amenable will they be to, let's say, doing lots of extensive boot camps, or these kinds of things are and that's another aspect to it. The place in your career and the place in your life too. What are you willing to sacrifice to get the win? And that's going to be a different answer to a player that is, let's say, much more mature and has had a lot more experiences at the top versus someone that's hungrier and is in a position in their life where they can give more of themselves and happily do so. So there's a lot of consideration. I mean, I could talk about this particular topic for a very long time, but that's just some of the the types of things you have to think about.
We're live in a studio. We invested in it.
That's
so we
fine.
I've
only been standing for 5 hours, but
you have a chair behind you, man. You can sit whenever the fuck you want.
We're gonna tease that out. This culture idea, I think, a little bit more. But Vans, I know you wanted to jump in here, so go for it.
Yeah, I mean, just to comment on what you were saying as well, Dan, I do see that as well, because I think you guys had a short video about the boot camping during the Open Qualifiers #1, where even Sean was mentioning, like, after games and after practices, Bang would actually still hang out with you guys and ask how he could develop as a player. So I could actually see that from your perspective, like, you want to look for players that are coachable, players that want to win. And from Sean's comments, that's already like a good step, at least by looking at Bang. So I think you guys made a good choice in that. First off, random question. Your face is fucking beautiful today, Dan. Do you like wax your eyebrows?
It's the facial hair. Nice. The facial is coming in strong.
I don't know, man. Like the whole package is so fucking dashing, dude. You don't have to comment.
That wasn't a fucking question, was it, you kid? Can you frame it like a question?
We actually
the real question. The real question is actually, I wanted to narrow it down a bit though, right? Because we talked about how Bang was coachable and doing very good, but I think another player that's been looking really good before you guys actually joined the roster was also jcStani. And jcStani put some amazing numbers as a national player. In the past, already had inklings that he didn't want to IGL, and then suddenly became an IGL again for like the Pioneers, and then now I'm assuming when he was in the trial run with 100 Thieves, he was also IGLing there. And what was the conversation like with jcStani? Because if you actually look at his tweet later on, it's like, I kind of was like, felt like I was left in limbo. I thought I was going to make it. The conversations looks promising. And then you guys went with a different direction in terms of IGLs by picking up Stellar instead. So what's the pros and cons that you see between these two players?
Yeah, so firstly, there's a lot to say about Bang because he is incredible. He's a really I mean, considering how young he is, he's extremely mature and professional. But that's what you just mentioned there, where he kind of stayed after a practice to ask the coaches. He just stayed behind, said, I'd like to talk to the coaches, because he had a feeling, even, and this was like after a scrim where we smashed the opponents in this particular scrim in this instance, and he felt like he didn't have enough impact on his role. So he's not thinking of the outcomes of did we win or not. He's thinking of his fundamental understanding of the game and what he wants to be able to do to provide value in his role. So because he couldn't figure out the answer to that himself, he asked the coaches, which means that he is constantly thinking of how to figure out that answer regardless of the outcome. The way that he thinks is fantastic, and he picked up a new role very quickly. So he's both a mixture of very coachable, but also takes a lot of emphasis on himself to figure out the problems himself. And so very smart player. And I think this was something that when we spoke to, because we had to do interviews with all of the players that we had on the roster at the time. And a quick point here as well is that when we came in to build the roster, this was, I was, transitioning out of my old job at the same time. So I was doing that whilst I was brought on. And essentially, I would have, wanted like some time to buffer, but there was no time. We're in the off season. We came in quite late. We had to build a roster. We had very little time to do it. So we were kind of having to make a lot of phone calls to a lot of different players and seeing, what's out there on the market, seeing, what players are, we're able to possibly trade, or like, essentially doing all of the juggling there whilst having all of these interviews and maybe trying to calling people back multiple times in some instances if we needed to, because we were trying to figure out what the best fit would be. And so with Bang, very quickly, when we spoke to him, we were like, all of us were immediately very impressed, because we kind of gained this sense of, firstly, he has a lot of talent. We saw that mechanically people speak extremely highly of him. He's very young, so we already knew that he was very skilled. But then when we understood that he had these other qualities, he was kind of perfect. Because also it wasn't just that, but we also knew that Asuna was a huge fan of Bang, and that they worked really well together. And so this is quite interesting, because we're already also kind of had our eyes on Derrek, because Derrek was a player that was he was one of the hottest commodities that was available, I think. And I think everybody kind of felt like that was like one of the most obvious choices, especially given the role that he was filling. And he's on the up, and he's got a great trajectory as a player. So it seemed like a really great choice, especially given the fact that, again, with all of the players that we've picked, we've made sure that the players that we're choosing have knowledge of each other ahead of time, that they've played with each other, possibly that there was already like some chemistry there. There's a rapport there that's there. That's a huge bonus, because that gives us a lot of information as to know how well the team's going to get along together in various circumstances. Because you can obviously put players together that are very skilled, but if they don't get along, that can be a huge problem given how much time they have to spend together and so on. So that was another plus of Bang. We knew that relationship-wise, he's going to get along really well with the other players, and so that was a big plus too. So the key thing here as well, was that Bang wanted to play smokes, and we didn't realize that until we spoke to him, but he wanted to switch to that role. Because we kind of had him pegged as like a flex player in our minds at that point, because he's so skilled and he is very quick at adapting at any role. But he wanted to be a dedicated smokes player, much like when he was on TSM. And so that was interesting to us, because one thing we were looking for was we wanted to get players that, they can be flexible in the longer term, but we needed people that were going to be very dedicated to and skilled and identify with a specific role. And because that was going to ensure that if we have to make changes in the future, it's a lot easier to solve for that problem, because that's an issue that lots of teams have, role overlap, or they're missing a key role. An in-game leader is something that, for example, Team Liquid has struggled with not having a dedicated proper in-game leader pretty much the entirety of that roster.
I mean, we talk about it all the time. Yeah.
And this is why we brought Stellar. So sorry, go ahead.
No, I mean, I'm not. I was just saying that's like, it's something that's so obvious that even like the public can sort of perceive that problem. But you're talking about Stellar, so I don't want to stop you.
Yeah, so so the in-game leader question. You mentioned jcStani, and I think again, jcStani is a very flexible player. I think it was with a lot of the options that we had, despite like how good he was. I think it was very difficult to kind of select for some of these roles, because again, we were really trying to select for a player that had that identity, especially in the IGL role, that identity that they want to be an in-game leader, and they have shown in their career that that's something that they have done for a while, and that's something that they want to stick to. That's the kind of career path that they want to have from kind of start to finish. Because unlike some of the other roles where we've seen a lot of players say, yeah, I can do I can be an IGL, and they jump into the role, here and there, based on what teams need. That's a little bit different to someone that really chooses that role, I think, and is invested in that. Because if you look at some of the greatest teams of all time, you're going to see in-game leaders that that they're always going to be a core aspect of that team, a pillar of that team, and they're people that are very invested in the things that go into that, and they identify very heavily with that. And so that was something we were quite concerned about when selecting for this role, and it's such a hard role to fill too. And so when we found Stella, we were really impressed firstly just with his fragging ability and the results that he had on teams where we felt like the results were an overperformance based on the skill that was on the team. And so, we kind of pegged that down to some of the in-game leading ability. But also with the in-game leading role, we also understood that we want a player that's going to be coachable for Sean Gares. Sean Gares obviously is a very experienced in-game leader. So we also wanted to, to some extent, that this player is someone that can be kind of groomed and molded by Sean to be an even better in-game leader and to really take that on. And what we found with Stellar as well is that Sean is really great, because he's helped to provide in the short term a lot of the kind of more complicated structure to kind of call from the beginning of rounds, like these kind of defaults that are more kind of set and powerful, and just like these kind of bigger, more structured things. Sean is able to provide to give Stellar what he is then very, very good at, which is then figuring out how to do the mid gaming. Because Stellar was struggling initially with that kind of how do I construct the whole kind of game plan, and that's something that's a relationship that they have that's very beneficial. Plus, Stellar can frag really effectively, and that was something that really stood out to us, because we wanted if we can have that, that's something we wanted. And in terms of every prospect that was on the table, Stellar was like the most consistent. Plus, he played the sentinel role as well. which was really important because that was also hard to find. So I mean, it kind of killed two birds with one stone for us.
Ironically, it was Stani himself that was like, I don't want to fucking play Sentinel anymore, you know, at one point, I think, in his sort of career. And obviously, that's something that you were looking for. And, you know, I thought, Dan, I'd ask, you know, like, what were you looking for in these players? But I think that's something you've teased out a little bit already. But I thought a better way to ask you that question is, how would you characterize the culture that you wanted to build? What are the pillars of the 100 Thieves culture that you wanted to institute from the day you started there?
Yeah, so this is, the culture is, as you said, I kind of mentioned it a little bit. It kind of starts with what are you trying to become and how do you kind of get there? Because you have to start that way just as well as you finish that way. And it's something that, you know, we're working on slowly, which is making sure that the players are all on the same page in terms of the conduct, in terms of how they view themselves as professionals. It's going to be all about essentially also how the players deal with conflict and as well as setbacks. And this is like a really important aspect. And it's something that, you know, we are able to encourage a lot as coaches. And, you know, we haven't, and this is actually, I think, by the way, one of the reasons why most teams have honeymoon periods. You don't run into a huge amount of conflict to begin with, because when your team isn't super established, you don't tend to see the issues yet. And those things tend to come on a little bit later. And that's, you know, we said that in the team, you know, for everyone right now, things feel great. And so to some extent, we haven't had to even drive home some of the things that we'll eventually need to, because we haven't run into some of those obstacles. But the best thing about this is that because Sean and I have a really strong sense as to how we want to handle certain things, like handle, as I mentioned, you know, conflict, and handle difficulty, and handle, you know, training, these kinds of things. When issues arise there, we can just immediately, we know what to look for and we can kind of correct. And that's like a big part of it. And if you look at a team like, again, I think Astralis from CSGO in their most dominant period is a great team to model after, where there's this sense that everybody has this, firstly, the sense of, you know, mutual respect for one another and the roles and authority that exists within the structure of the team. But they're all committed to, you know, one singular goal, which is to be not just the best team in the world, you know, as soon as possible, but for a very long time. And understanding that that's the goal, and kind of always coming back to that goal. And that the thing is that something like that, there are some general objective things that you need to kind of bake in to the culture in terms of conduct, how you see yourself as a professional, and framing the goals that are ahead. But at the same time, it is also individual to an extent, because whenever you're kind of in a position like I am here, especially, I'm managing human beings. And so no one human being is like another. So you have to kind of optimize for them as you go. And, you know, being able to put in the work and do it in the right way is so important. And I think that the team is in a really good place with that right now, because the other thing we're not interested in doing is overworking the players and not respecting them as individuals, because that's another thing. And this is an interesting spot right now, because right now we have what's in vogue, which is boot camping for, you know, as much time as you possibly can. And so we also want a culture of smart work over hard work in that regard, because we don't want to burn players out. We want them to be able to make the growth in the most efficient ways possible, whilst also feeling like their life has enough balance to it, so again, because we're looking at the long term here. This happens to a lot of rosters where they get burnt out because they're overworked, or because they're in a position where they start to get unhappy, because, you know, if you're neglecting areas of your life, then you start to get unhappy if those areas are important to you. It's really easy to get caught up in it in this culture where only winning matters. And yeah, you know, we're professionals, we want to be the best team in the world for a long time. Only winning does matter, but that's not the whole story. There's a lot more to that, because we're human beings. So optimizing for all these things as we go, with this overall framework of the goal is really kind of where we're at. And I'm actually looking forward to when we run into problems, because I'm looking forward to getting to solve that. Because when you, just like any relationship, once you run into, you know, great conflict, if you're able to have the ability to resolve that with that common goal in mind, you become way stronger. So that's what we're looking to always do.
Hopefully if you come back to casting with Riot, that means that's an obstacle that has been, you know, mended.
You are overdosing.
I can only dream about Dan
right
casting
now,
again, man. But now as a GM here, Dan, you've picked all the right pieces. The team has been formed, and you talked about how you don't want the players to burn out. So I think naturally you're looking at. I'm thinking about like the support system that goes around the team in itself, right? So you have Sean that's going to spend some time that's going to be developing strats with Stellar. Mike's we haven't mentioned before, but is acting like I'm assuming here an assistant coach. As most of the times when I was watching you guys do the Immortal Minds, it was a lot about you guys just literally breaking down every single play of the TSM and the Sentinels of 2020. And is there anybody else within that support system that's really helping out the team and even Mike's and Sean so that they don't get overworked themselves?
Right now, it is just us. We're looking to. I don't think there's definitely things I can't say right now, but in terms of how the team's going to operate now and definitely through this stage, it is us three that's bear the burden of making sure that the team has everything that it needs and in terms of getting the wins. And I can add some more detail to this. It's not directly to your question, but in terms of like how to be effective in terms of how the practice goes, how the expertise goes on the team with regards to especially Sean and what he's able to provide. Because with Sean, as the head coach, he is he's the guy that makes the decisions on how practice goes. He's the guy that makes the decisions as to how the team should operate strategically and tactically. So that's what he is there to do. And because we have limited time, we had to figure out how to best even go through things. So the decision that was made was that we had 3 weeks to prepare for the open qualifiers, for example. And he decided that I need to spend at least a couple hours a day with the players, making sure that before we go into scrims, that we get time to review VODs, time for him to explain and lay down kind of foundational theory in terms of what his philosophy is on the strategical side of the game. And so, Sean, if Sean was an actor, he would be like a method actor. He's so invested to the deepest level when it comes to a job like this in terms of the strategy. And so he puts an enormous amount of effort in doing all of that. And that is, as I mentioned previously, it fills currently such a huge hole for the where the team was, because we wanted to be a team that could play every map, and we're trying to do that in 3 weeks, essentially before the qualifiers. And Sean also, it was he used his CS experience to understand how do you win the veto, because that's a great place to start. If you're always starting on the back foot in a veto, that you should never be in that position. We want the team to be confident, and when going into a veto, that the other team's always going to be in a position where they're like, crap, that team is going to get a map that's their home ground, and we're probably going to lose there. And for us, evidently on the qualifiers, we had split and fracture there. Evidently that's what happened. We didn't design it specifically. We didn't over design it in that way necessarily. But we had to rely on the feedback from the team in terms of where the team was in terms of their results, and we had to kind of manage that going forward. Because again, with so little time in a game with so many variables, there wasn't, we had to cut a lot of corners, and we had to guesstimate a lot of things. So in terms of being able to prepare the team for long-term success, but then again, we couldn't not win or qualify. Like, that's not a reality that could have happened. And so we were very nervous, in that sense, because going in there from the beginning, we didn't have, we have this lineup that I think a lot of people looked at, and they're kind of scratching their heads because it's not all of these huge names that they're expecting. It's like, Ethan's not on the team. What are you doing? And, we had a lot of criticism for a lot of these choices from the public, because people couldn't really see what we saw, and they didn't have the understanding of the vision that we had. So there's a lot of like cutting corners and min-maxing that had to take place. And as I mentioned, the way that Stella works in terms of leading the team, it just works very well with exactly the approach that Sean has, and this is by design, to try to make sure that the team can always operate most effectively to get the wins short term, yes, and then also build it out for that long term. So that balance is always a difficult one. And then Mike is really amazing in terms of filling out all of the gaps, that the things that Sean can't see necessarily, or like seeing the issues that players might have and optimizing for the smaller details in particular. Are there certain lineups that are missing that people just don't see right now? That because Mike has, you know, a great eye for the game in pretty much all facets, and so he's done a great job in terms of his support in that nature. So really we're taking a lot of the burden away from the players with the expertise that Sean and Mike has right now, and that's how it's been operating. And then we're also trying to make sure that when we scrim, we're not just trying to scrim to grind games, we're trying to scrim with intention. So that's kind of how the support has been, and I'm there sort of making sure that everything operationally is working, and kind of, you know, making sure that the players have exactly what they need, and making sure that Sean and Mike have what they need, and that relationship's, you know, like working, and that everything with the team and in general is conducive to them getting the results. So I have to kind of have the more macro view as well as kind of looking at everything. So that's kind of how it's been working.
So there was never a reality where you didn't qualify. I like that, because I wanted to touch on that combined with something you said earlier, which was that, you know, obviously Sean maybe had that little bit of a competitive itch, but going into the coaching, I know I spoke to him a little bit in Berlin about that it was something that would scratch that competitive itch for him without having to go onto the server. Now, you guys did qualify, and you, I mean, you did it dominantly in the second run. But I want to know, is there a story? Is there a moment? What were the vibes like? Whatever you want. I don't want to give you a leading question on this, but those losses to TSM, I mean, that's the first time for Sean in quite a while, I imagine, that he felt that side of competition. What was it like?
Yeah, it was really difficult because it's very frustrating when, and again, I think Sean did a really great job in terms of his timing on calling the timeouts and how he uses the timeouts are really effective. But, you know, as such a young team, you run into a matchup like that where your opponent's doing something and your team is unable to adjust in the ways that you want. And on top of that, you know, we had a sense of how some of the adjustments should work on the maps we were expecting ahead of time. So we kind of knew what was going to happen, but the team didn't have experience against certain things. So they're trying to experience something for the first time and trying to make the adjustments within the 12 rounds of a half. So there were a lot of challenges there. So it was, I think it wasn't as bad. It felt pretty bad because we knew that it was going to be, we were gonna have to go, you know, demon mode to get through the lower bracket run, especially because we were playing like salary teams like every game. Like we had like a really hard run with every game, and we had no idea what to expect.
To give it, yeah, exactly. TSM, Moon Raccoons, then you got Gen G, Evil Geniuses, fucking Knights as well, which you beat. They were looking really good, and then TSM again. That's a really tough run. Holy shit!
Pretty insane.
RNG.
Pretty insane.
I'd like to know, I'm sure, you know, you want to, when you join an org like this, we're running out of time, so I might sort of end on this note. When you join an org, you know, obviously there's a sense that you want your goals to be aligned, but from you, Dan, I'm really interested in, first of all, what were the expectations set down by 100 Thieves? You know what I mean? Because I get the impression that it's pretty fucking cutthroat to GM and coach a team in such a high stakes tournament. So what were their expectations? And then what are yours? What are your goals in the medium, let's say short and then long term? You know what I mean? And you know, to what degree do they align? And I'm sure they diverge in some ways, because obviously the interests are different as the parties are different. But I'd love to know what the spread of aspiration is there.
Yeah, so I think firstly with the GM role, the way that I think any organization looks at that role is supposed to at least be a long-term thing. Which is why I think they waited so long to try to figure it out, because they wanted to make sure that they understood more about the kind of environment and also their own needs and sort of how things are going to be fleshed out and sort of have more of a vision before they were ready to pull the trigger there. It's a long-term role, but, you know, I'm deliverable for winning as much as possible over as long as a period of time as possible. And that's how that role functions. And what I think really resonated between myself and 100 Thieves, and I think the same thing with casting for me, and just going back to just at a core, like I'm just competitive and I just want to win, I want to do anything to win, is that that's how they view it. That 100 Thieves has an extremely large amount of pressure because it's a reflection of how much they want to win and how much they're willing to put in to winning. So if you're not sort of on board with that, then they're not going to be on board with you. So in that way, I actually align, because I think for me with casting, I felt like that process because casting, you're not really competing in the same way. But in
we
terms
did,
of, like,
Dan. We fucking did every day, man.
but yeah, I mean, and you're competing with yourself, and ultimately you want to be the best version of what you're trying to accomplish. And I don't think that, let's say, in commentary or a lot of things that aren't competition related, that you can make you can always make an argument that various people are the best and so on. It's not really about that, but it's this sense of having no restrictions to being able to pursue like an elite level, to pursue greatness or excellence with the product or whatever you're trying to create. And I think with 100 Thieves, that's what they offered. They're saying, look, what we want to do is we want to win at any cost. And we want someone that is on board with that and is okay with the pressure of that, because that's their philosophy as well. And so I think the answer to the question is that we just align. We just align on that. And the pressure that's there is welcome for me, because I'm taking that as a cue for growth, and as a reflection that they're putting that level of faith, because they have that level of belief in myself, Sean, and Mike, to create this team and to run this team.
Yeah. Dan, you look great. You smell really good.
Thank you.
I miss you.
You too.
It's been a little too long. I think your facial hair is great.
Yeah. Last time we saw each other, we had a lot of meat. It was good.
Yeah, we did. A lot of meat. We have to do
Mitch,
that again.
get off my fucking man.
We have to do that again soon, okay? But yeah, look, thanks for taking the time, Dan, to talk with us, because I know like a lot of hype, but obviously with that hype sometimes it's not always like super nitty-gritty substantive stuff. So we're really thankful to have you here just to sort of speak at length about this, and maybe again in the future if you can find the time, we'd love to discuss, because we hardly even talked about the fact that you guys are just plowing right now and doing a great job. So thanks so much for joining us on the show, bro, and I hope to see you soon.
Thanks, guys. Catch you later.